The sun rises over the 7 hills of Rome, casting long shadows across the marble columns and terracotta rooftops of a city that will soon command the world. In the gentle morning light, the Forum Romanum stirs to life with the measured footsteps of Togate senators, the soft murmur of merchants arranging their wares, and the distant sound of temple bells marking the sacred hours. This is Rome in the final century before Christ. A republic grown mighty through conquest, yet trembling with internal tensions, where ambitious young men of noble birth dream of glory and immortality. Among these dreamers walks one whose name will echo through millennia, though in this dawn light he appears as merely another patrician youth learning the ancient ways of power. Gaius Julius Caesar emerges from this world of privilege and tradition, born into a family that traces its lineage to the goddess Venus herself through Aeneas of Troy. The Julian gens claims descent from kings and gods, their ancestry woven into the very founding myths of Rome. Yet by Caesar's birth around 100 BCE, their political influence has waned like afternoon shadows growing long. The family maintains its patrician status and social connections, but lacks the crushing wealth and immediate power wielded by families like the Crassi, or the commanding military reputation of houses like the Pompeys. Young Caesar grows up understanding that his noble blood grants him access to the corridors of power, but guarantees him nothing within them. The Rome of Caesar's youth pulses with opportunity and danger in equal measure. The Republic has expanded beyond anyone's wildest dreams, stretching from the misty shores of Gaul to the sun-baked provinces of Africa, from the wine-dark Aegean to the broad Atlantic. Yet this very success breeds new challenges, as traditional Roman institutions strain under the weight of governing an empire. Massive wealth flows into the city from conquered territories, creating fortunes that dwarf the modest holdings of old patrician families, while generals return from distant campaigns with veteran legions loyal to them personally, rather than to the abstract concept of the Roman state. In this swirling vortex of ambition and transformation, young Caesar must learn to navigate the treacherous currents of Roman politics. The cursus honorum, the time-honored sequence of magistracies that marks a Roman politician's ascent, becomes Caesar's roadmap to prominence. This ancient ladder of office, sanctified by centuries of tradition, requires patience, strategic thinking, and careful cultivation of relationships among the electorate. Each rung demands its own set of skills and connections, from the minor magistracies that handle the daily administration of the city to the great consulship that represents the pinnacle of republican achievement. Caesar approaches this challenge with the methodical persistence of a master craftsman, understanding that each office must be won not merely through family name or personal charm, but through a delicate balance of public service, private negotiation, and political theatre. The earliest steps of Caesar's political journey unfold in the shadow of two towering figures who dominate the Roman landscape like twin colossi. Gaius Marius, the great general and multiple consul, represents the populist tradition that appeals directly to the common people and uses their support to overwhelm traditional aristocratic resistance. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, equally brilliant but utterly opposed in philosophy, champions the cause of the Optimates, the traditionalist faction that seeks to preserve the ancient prerogatives of the Senate and the established order. These two titans clash in civil wars that drench Roman soil in Roman blood, leaving young Caesar to witness firsthand how personal ambition can tear apart the fabric of the state. Caesar's family connections place him squarely in the Marian camp through his marriage to Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, one of Marius's key allies. This alliance, forged while Caesar is still a young man, demonstrates his early understanding that political advancement requires not merely individual talent, but carefully chosen partnerships that expand one's influence and resources. When Sulla achieves final victory and begins his systematic purging of Marian supporters, Caesar faces his first great test of character and political survival. The dictator demands that Caesar divorce Cornelia as proof of his break with the Marian faction, a command that would signal complete submission to the new order while abandoning both personal honor and political principle. Caesar's refusal to divorce his wife reveals the steel beneath his polished exterior. showing a willingness to risk everything rather than compromise on matters of fundamental importance. This defiance forces him into temporary exile, a period of enforced wandering that might have destroyed a lesser man, but instead provides Caesar with invaluable experience of the wider world beyond Rome's walls. He travels through Asia Minor, observing different systems of government, studying military tactics, and absorbing the cultural richness of the Greek East. These years of exile, though dangerous and uncertain, broaden his perspective immeasurably and help him understand that Rome's destiny lies not merely in controlling territory, but in synthesizing the best elements of Mediterranean civilization. The death of Sulla opens new pathways for Caesar's return to Roman political life, though he remains cautious about revealing the full extent of his ambitions. He begins his formal ascent of the cursus honorum with the quaestorship, the entry-level magistracy that typically involves financial administration and provides essential training in the complexities of Roman bureaucracy. Caesar secures assignment to Further Spain, a posting that removes him from the immediate scrutiny of Roman politics, while offering opportunities to demonstrate competence in provincial administration. His performance in Spain proves exemplary, showing both administrative skill and the kind of personal magnetism that binds subordinates to their commander through loyalty rather than mere duty. Returning to Rome with enhanced reputation and modest wealth, Caesar begins weaving the complex web of alliances that will support his continued advancement. Roman politics operates through intricate networks of obligation and mutual benefit, where a favor granted today might be repaid with crucial support years in the future. Caesar proves himself a master of this delicate art, cultivating relationships across factional lines while maintaining his core identity as a popularis, a politician who appeals to the broader citizenry rather than limiting himself to the narrow circles of the senatorial elite. His charm proves legendary, even in a city famous for its smooth-tongued orators, as he combines genuine warmth with calculating intelligence in proportions that few can resist. The aedileship marks Caesar's next significant step up the political ladder, offering him the chance to oversee public works, religious festivals, and the grain supply that keeps Rome's vast population fed and content. Caesar approaches these responsibilities with characteristic ambition, understanding that spectacular public displays can create lasting impressions that translate into electoral support. He spends lavishly on games and festivals, borrowing heavily against future prospects to fund entertainments that dazzle the Roman populace. These expenditures represent calculated investments in his political future, demonstrating both his commitment to public service and his understanding that Roman voters respond to politicians who enhance their lives through magnificent spectacle. Caesar's growing reputation attracts the attention of Rome's most powerful figures, including Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose immense wealth makes him a kingmaker in Roman politics. Crassus recognizes Caesar's potential and begins providing the financial backing that enables increasingly ambitious projects and political campaigns. This partnership proves mutually beneficial, as Caesar's popularity with the masses complements Crassus's resources, while Crassus's support provides Caesar with the material foundation necessary for sustained political competition. Their relationship demonstrates Caesar's skill at identifying and cultivating the alliances that multiply his own capabilities while advancing his patron's interests. Through all these early maneuvers, Caesar displays remarkable consistency in his political positioning, maintaining his popularis credentials while avoiding the extremism that destroys so many promising careers. He supports legislation benefiting ordinary citizens, advocates for the interests of Roman allies and provincial populations, and consistently opposes measures that would concentrate additional power in the hands of the traditional senatorial elite. Yet, he conducts this opposition with such skill and grace that even his political enemies find it difficult to question his motives or methods. This delicate balance between principle and pragmatism becomes a hallmark of Caesar's approach, allowing him to build broad coalitions while maintaining the focused ambition that drives him inexorably toward the highest offices of the state. As Caesar's reputation grew within Rome's political circles, the city itself seemed to pulse with the ambitions of powerful men, each calculating their next move in the endless chess game of republican politics. The Forum Romanum echoed with the voices of orators, while in the shadowed porticos and private gardens of the Palatine Hill, whispered conversations shaped the destiny of nations. It was against this backdrop of intrigue and opportunity that Caesar began to weave the most audacious political alliance of his generation. The year 60 BCE found Rome at a crossroads, its traditional institutions straining under the weight of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic shores of Hispania to the sun-baked valleys of Syria. Three men, each commanding different spheres of power and influence, found themselves drawn together by the magnetic pull of mutual necessity and shared ambition. Pompey the Great stood as Rome's most celebrated general, his victories in the east having added vast territories to the Republic's dominion, yet his political position remained frustratingly precarious. Crassus, whose wealth flowed like the golden streams of distant Iberia, possessed the financial resources to move mountains, but lacked the military glory that Roman society so deeply prized. Between them stood Caesar, neither as wealthy as Crassus, nor as militarily distinguished as Pompey, but possessed of a political acumen that seemed to cut through the labyrinthine complexities of Roman governance like a blade through silk. The formation of what later generations would call the First Triumvirate emerged not from grand proclamations in the Senate House, but from quiet meetings in suburban villas, where the three men recognized that their individual limitations could become collective strengths. Pompey's veterans languished without the land grants he had promised them, while the Senate's conservative faction blocked his every move with the stubborn persistence of ancient tradition. Crassus chafed under the memory of Pompey's eastern triumphs, his own suppression of Spartacus's slave rebellion seeming pale by comparison, despite the rivers of gold it had protected. Caesar, meanwhile, possessed the political connections and rhetorical skills to navigate the treacherous currents of senatorial debate. Yet he needed both military command and financial backing to achieve the greatness that seemed to call to him from beyond Rome's 7 hills. The alliance crystallized gradually, like wine settling in amphorae stored deep beneath the city's bustling streets. Caesar's consulship in 59 BCE became the crucible in which this partnership was forged. Each piece of legislation a carefully crafted instrument designed to satisfy the needs of all three partners. The land bill that would settle Pompey's veterans was pushed through with a determination that brooked no opposition, while Crassus's business interests received the protection and favorable treatment that only consular authority could provide. The Senate's traditional prerogatives seemed to melt away like morning mist before Caesar's relentless legislative program, as the young consul demonstrated that the old ways of doing business could be swept aside when necessity demanded it. Yet for all the immediate gains that flowed from this alliance, Caesar's eyes were already turning beyond the boundaries of Italy toward the mist-shrouded forests and fertile plains that lay beyond the Alps. The proconsular command that would follow his consulship represented more than mere political advancement. It was the key to military glory, personal enrichment, and the kind of legendary status that only conquest could provide. Gaul beckoned like a vast, untamed wilderness, waiting to be brought within the embrace of Roman civilization, its tribes and territories representing both challenge and opportunity on a scale that few Roman commanders had ever contemplated. The political maneuvering that secured Caesar's appointment to the Gallic provinces unfolded with the precision of a master strategist, positioning his pieces on a board whose dimensions encompassed the entire Mediterranean world. The assignment initially covered Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, regions that offered significant potential for military action and territorial expansion, yet it was the last-minute addition of Transalpine Gaul that transformed the appointment from important to epical. This final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Metellus Sella, the original designee for the Transalpine Command, died unexpectedly, creating an opportunity that Caesar's allies seized with the swiftness of eagles diving upon their prey. The Senate's reluctant acquiescence to this expanded command reflected the complex political calculations that governed every major decision in the late Republic. Conservative senators, who might have preferred to limit Caesar's opportunities, found themselves outmaneuvered by the triumviral alliance. Their traditional tactics of delay and obstruction proving inadequate against the coordinated pressure applied by Pompey's veterans, Crassus's wealth, and Caesar's political network. The 5-year term granted to this extraordinary command represented an unprecedented concentration of power and opportunity, placing vast resources and virtually unlimited potential for conquest at Caesar's disposal. As preparations began for the great adventure that would carry Caesar beyond the familiar boundaries of the Roman world, the magnitude of the undertaking became apparent in every detail. The legions that would march northward represented the finest military instrument that centuries of Roman warfare had created, their standardized equipment and tactics honed through countless campaigns across the length and breadth of the Mediterranean. Supply lines stretching from the workshops of Italy to the frontier outposts of southern Gaul carried the sinews of war: bronze and iron for weapons, leather for armor, grain for sustenance, and gold for the 1,000 transactions that kept armies moving forward into unknown territories. The intelligence networks that preceded Caesar's advance into Gaul painted pictures of a land divided among numerous tribes, each jealously guarding their territories, while simultaneously engaging in the complex diplomatic and military relationships that had shaped Celtic politics for generations. These reports spoke of warriors whose courage was legendary, of druids whose wisdom commanded respect across tribal boundaries, and of settlements whose wealth in gold and agricultural produce suggested rich rewards for successful conquest. Yet they also revealed the fundamental weakness that would prove decisive in the campaigns to come: the inability of these diverse peoples to unite effectively against external threats. Caesar's appointment to the Gallic command represented the convergence of personal ambition with historical opportunity on a scale that few individuals in human history have encountered. The young proconsul, who would soon cross the Alps, carried with him not merely the authority of Roman magistracy, but the accumulated wisdom of centuries of military innovation, political organization, and cultural assimilation that had transformed a small Italian city-state into the master of the known world. Behind him stretched the resources of an empire, while ahead lay territories whose conquest would add immeasurably to both Roman power and his own legendary status. The bonds that held the triumviral alliance together were strengthened further by the marriage of Caesar's daughter Julia to Pompey, a union that transformed political convenience into personal affection and created new stakes in the partnership's success. This dynastic connection wove the three men's fortunes together with threads of family loyalty and mutual obligation that would prove crucial in the challenging years ahead, when the pressures of distance and differing priorities might otherwise have strained their cooperation to the breaking point. As Caesar prepared to depart for his provincial command, Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, sensing perhaps that one of its most ambitious sons was embarking upon an adventure that would reshape the ancient world. The proconsul, who had maneuvered so skillfully through the labyrinth of republican politics, was about to test those same talents against the warriors of Gaul, carrying with him the hopes and resources of the triumviral alliance into territories where Roman eagles had never flown. With the governorship of Gaul secured through political maneuvering that would have impressed Machiavelli himself, Caesar found himself standing at the threshold of destiny in the spring of 58 BCE. The vast territories beyond the Alps stretched before him like an unwritten chapter in the annals of Roman ambition, their misty forests and rolling hills concealing tribes whose names would soon echo through eternity. What had begun as a calculated political appointment, designed to provide Caesar with the wealth and military credentials necessary for his eventual return to Rome, would transform into something far more profound, a campaign that would reshape not only the map of Europe, but the very essence of the man who led it. The Celtic tribes of Gaul lived in a world ancient beyond Roman memory, where druids conducted their sacred rites in groves of oak trees that had witnessed the passing of countless generations. Their settlements dotted the landscape, like islands of civilization amid vast stretches of primeval wilderness, connected by networks of trade routes that carried amber from the Baltic shores and tin from distant Cornwall. The Helvetii, dwelling in the mountainous regions that would one day be called Switzerland, possessed a warrior culture that valued honor above life itself, their bronze shields catching the morning light as they prepared for battles that would determine the fate of their people for centuries to come. Caesar's first encounter with these formidable adversaries came as the Helvetia attempted their Great Migration, a movement of entire populations that threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of power throughout the region. The Roman general, still more politician than soldier in the eyes of many, watched from the ramparts of his hastily constructed fortifications as hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children streamed across the landscape, their wagons laden with the accumulated treasures of generations, their cattle lowing in the distance, like thunder rolling across the plains. This was no mere military engagement, but a clash between two fundamentally different ways of life: the ordered, systematic approach of Roman civilization against the raw, untamed energy of Celtic tribal society. The transformation that occurred within Caesar during these early campaigns defied the expectations of friend and enemy alike. Where once had stood a man known primarily for his silver tongue and political acumen, there now emerged a military mind of extraordinary clarity and innovation. His legions, initially skeptical of their commander's abilities on the battlefield, began to witness tactical brilliance that elevated warfare from mere violence to something approaching art. Caesar possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the terrain, to anticipate enemy movements, and to position his forces in ways that maximized their strengths while exploiting the weaknesses of his opponents. The forests of Gaul became Caesar's classroom, their shadowed depths teaching him lessons that no amount of study in Rome could have provided. He learned to move vast armies through terrain that had never felt the tread of Roman sandals, to construct bridges across rivers that Celtic legend claimed were protected by ancient spirits, to siege fortresses perched on hilltops that seemed to touch the very clouds themselves. Each campaign brought new challenges that demanded innovative solutions, and Caesar met them with a combination of Roman engineering prowess and an increasingly sophisticated understanding of Celtic psychology and tactics. The Druids, those mysterious keepers of Celtic wisdom and lore, watched Caesar's advance with growing alarm as their ancient world began to crumble beneath the methodical progress of Roman conquest. These learned men, who could recite genealogies stretching back 20 generations and whose astronomical calculations rivaled those of Alexandria, found themselves powerless against an enemy that fought not just with sword and spear, but with roads and aqueducts, legal codes and standardized currency. The sacred groves, where they had conducted their rites for countless centuries, echoed with the sound of Roman axes, as Caesar systematically dismantled not just the political structures of Celtic society, but its spiritual foundations as well. Vercingetorix, the young Arverni chieftain, who would become Caesar's most formidable adversary, represented everything that was noble and doomed about Celtic resistance to Roman expansion. Tall and golden-haired, with eyes that burned with the fierce independence of his mountain people, he possessed the rare combination of personal magnetism and strategic genius necessary to unite the fractured tribes of Gaul under a single banner. His very name, meaning Great King of Warriors, seemed to capture the desperate hope of a people fighting for their ancestral way of life against an enemy whose inexorable advance resembled the changing of the seasons themselves, natural, inevitable, and utterly transformative. The Siege of Alesia stands as perhaps the greatest testament to Caesar's evolution from politician to military genius, a masterpiece of engineering and tactical planning that demonstrated Roman capabilities at their absolute zenith. Perched atop its steep plateau like an eagle's eyrie, the fortress seemed impregnable, its walls rising from cliffs that had defied countless earlier attackers. Caesar's response was characteristically audacious. Rather than attempt a direct assault that would have cost thousands of Roman lives, he chose to surround the entire plateau with not one, but two sets of fortifications, creating a double wall that trapped the defenders while simultaneously protecting his own forces from relief attempts. The construction of these magnificent works, known to history as the circumvallation and contravallation, required engineering skills that pushed Roman military science to its very limits. Legionaries who had enlisted as simple soldiers found themselves transformed into architects and builders, their calloused hands shaping earthworks and palisades with the precision of master craftsmen. The sound of their labor echoed across the Burgundian hills from dawn until dusk, the rhythmic hammering of countless tools creating a percussion that spoke of Roman determination and organizational genius. Within the besieged fortress, Vercingetorix and his warriors faced the slow agony of starvation as their supplies dwindled with each passing day. The Celtic chieftain's magnificent war chariot, inlaid with gold and decorated with the symbols of his ancestors, stood silent in the fortress courtyard as he paced the walls like a caged wolf, his keen eyes searching the horizon for signs of the relief army that represented his people's last hope. The irony was bitter. He, who had united the tribes of Gaul more effectively than any leader in memory, now found himself trapped within stone walls, watching his dream of Celtic independence slowly die beneath the methodical pressure of Roman siege warfare. The arrival of the relief army, 60,000 strong and representing nearly every tribe in Gaul, should have spelled doom for Caesar's outnumbered legions. Instead, it provided the stage for one of history's most remarkable military victories, as Caesar found himself simultaneously besieging Alesia and being besieged by the relief force. The Roman general, his once soft politician's hands now scarred by months of campaign life, moved between his inner and outer fortifications like a master conductor orchestrating a symphony of war, his presence alone worth several cohorts in maintaining the morale of his hard-pressed legions. The final assault came with the fury of a Celtic thunderstorm, as warriors painted with woad and wielding weapons blessed by their druids hurled themselves against Roman fortifications with the desperate courage of men fighting for everything they held dear. The air filled with the clash of iron on iron, the war cries of charging Gauls mixing with the disciplined shouts of Roman centurions as they rallied their men to hold the line. In that moment, as fate balanced on a sword's edge, Caesar demonstrated the quality that would define his legend. At the crucial instant, when victory or defeat hung in the balance, he personally led his reserve cavalry in a charge that shattered Celtic resistance and sealed the fate of Gaul forever. The surrender of Vercingetorix marked not just the end of Celtic independence, but the completion of Caesar's transformation from ambitious politician to military legend. The proud chieftain, dressed in his finest armor and riding his most magnificent horse, approached Caesar's camp with the dignity of a king acknowledging defeat, his gesture both defiant and resigned. In that moment, two worlds met and parted, the ancient mystical realm of Celtic Gaul and the disciplined, expanding empire of Rome, with Caesar standing as the architect of this monumental transition that would echo through the centuries to come. The golden eagles of the legions had grown heavy with the weight of 8 years' conquest, their bronze feathers dulled by the mists of Celtic forests and the dust of Germanic plains. Caesar's veterans, men whose faces bore the scars of 100 battles, had transformed from the uncertain soldiers who first crossed into Helvetia territory into an instrument of war so finely honed that it moved with the precision of a single mind. The wealth of Gaul flowed through their fingers like water, gold torques stripped from fallen chieftains, silver coins bearing the images of forgotten kings, and slaves whose strong backs would build the monuments of Rome. Yet even as Caesar's name echoed through the marble halls of the Eternal City, carried on the lips of senators who whispered of his growing power, the general himself stood at the banks of a modest river that would become the boundary between ambition and immortality. The Rubicon moved through the winter landscape of northern Italy with the quiet persistence of destiny itself, its waters dark against the frost-covered stones along its banks. Roman law, ancient as the 7 hills themselves, declared this narrow stream the sacred boundary beyond which no general might bring his armies without explicit permission from the Senate. To cross meant civil war. To remain meant submission to enemies who had already begun sharpening their knives in the shadows of the Curia. Caesar's spies brought word that Cato the Younger paced the marble floors of the Senate House, his harsh voice calling for the prosecution of the conqueror of Gaul, while Pompey the Great, once Caesar's ally in the triumvirate, now turned his calculating gaze northward with the cold appraisal of a rival measuring an opponent. The decision crystallized on a January night in the year 49 before the Christian era, when Caesar sat in his tent, surrounded by maps that bore the fresh ink of conquered territories. Outside, the campfires of the 13th Legion flickered against the darkness like fallen stars, their light catching the faces of men who had followed their commander through the forests of the Belgae and the mountain passes of the Helvetii. The wind carried the sound of armor being cleaned and sharpened, the low murmur of soldiers sharing stories of battles won and comrades lost, the eternal rhythms of a military camp settling into the deep quiet that precedes momentous action. Caesar's fingers traced the line of the Rubicon on his maps, that thin blue mark that separated the province he governed from the heartland of the republic he had sworn to serve. When morning broke across the frost-covered plains, Caesar mounted his horse and rode to the river's edge, his scarlet cloak streaming behind him like a banner of war. The waters reflected his face, showing him a man transformed by 8 years of command, his features sharpened by the weight of decision, his eyes holding the distant look of one who had gazed across the corpse-strewn fields of Elysia and emerged victorious. The phrase that history would remember forever passed his lips like a prayer to the gods of fortune. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. His horse's hooves broke the surface of the sacred boundary, sending ripples across the dark water that would spread outward through the centuries, touching every shore where Roman eagles would plant themselves in foreign soil. The civil war that followed transformed the Mediterranean world into a vast chessboard, where legions moved like pieces in a game played by gods. Pompey, the man who had once brought the treasures of the East to Rome's feet, fled southward with the Senate at his back, leaving the capital to Caesar's approaching forces like a prize too precious to defend. The streets of Rome echoed with the measured tread of the 10th Legion, as Caesar's veterans filed through gates that had stood inviolate for centuries, their weathered faces reflecting neither triumph nor arrogance, only the professional satisfaction of soldiers who had completed another march in service to their commander. The Forum, where Cicero's golden voice had once swayed the masses, and where Crassus had counted his gold, now rang with the administrative efficiency of Caesar's secretaries as they organized the seizure of the treasury and the restoration of order to a city abandoned by its traditional rulers. The pursuit of Pompey carried Caesar's forces across the wine-dark waters of the Adriatic, where ancient Greek cities watched the passage of Roman warships with the weary recognition of peoples who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires since before Troy's walls echoed with the cries of heroes. At Dyrrhachium, Caesar tasted the bitter medicine of defeat, his lines broken by Pompey's superior position, and his veterans bloodied by an enemy who had learned the lessons of Gallic warfare all too well. The Mediterranean sun beat down on scattered Roman shields and the bodies of men who had survived the forests of Germania, only to fall on Greek soil, their sacrifice measured in the cold mathematics of military necessity that Caesar read in the tactical situation like an augur interpreting the flight of birds. But the gods of war are fickle in their favour, and at Pharsalus, on a plain where the wheat grew thick and golden under the Thessalian sun, Caesar's genius for battlefield improvisation turned defeat into the kind of victory that reshapes the world. His veterans, their armour polished to mirror brightness, their peeler sharp as winter frost, advanced across ground that would be remembered as the graveyard of the Roman Republic. Pompey's forces, larger and better supplied, dissolved like morning mist before the disciplined fury of men who had learned their trade in the barbarous lands beyond the Alps, their formations breaking apart as Caesar's cavalry swept around their flank with the inexorable force of destiny itself. When the sun set over Pharsalus, it illuminated a field scattered with the wreckage of the old order, where senators' sons lay mingled with Spanish auxiliaries and Gallic horsemen, their blood seeping into soil that would nurture stories of this day for 1,000 years. Pompey's flight to Egypt carried the dying echoes of the Republic's last defiance across the Middle Sea, where the ancient kingdom of the Ptolemies waited like a spider in its web of intrigue and assassination. Caesar's pursuit took him past islands where Greek heroes had once struggled against wind and wave. Following a trail of rumor and desperation that would lead to the blood-stained beach where Pompey's head would be severed from his shoulders by a blade wielded in the name of expediency. The young pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII, calculating that Caesar would reward the murder of his enemy, presented the conqueror with this grisly trophy, only to discover that Romans, whatever their politics, honored courage in their opponents and despised the treachery of those who would kill for advantage. Caesar's tears over Pompey's remains were witnessed by the eternal pyramids and the inscrutable Sphinx, monuments that had watched the rise of pharaohs and the march of Alexander's phalanxes, now silent observers as the last great general of the Republic mourned his fallen rival. The Egyptian court, perfumed with frankincense and heavy with the weight of 3,000 years of civilization, became the stage for Caesar's encounter with Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, whose intelligence blazed as brightly as the lighthouse that guided ships into Alexandria's harbour. Their alliance, forged in the marble halls where scholars had once debated philosophy and mathematics, would reshape the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean and plant the seeds of an empire that would endure long after the last pharaoh had been laid to rest in her golden tomb. The civil war's final spasms carried Caesar across the breadth of the known world, from the olive groves of Africa, where Cato the Younger chose death before dishonor, to the Spanish hills where Pompey's sons made their last desperate stand against the tide of history. Each victory added another layer to the legend growing around Caesar's name. Each battle another verse in the epic that bards would sing around campfires from Britain's misty shores to the sun-baked borders of Mesopotamia. The republic that had conquered the Mediterranean through the collective will of its citizen soldiers now lay broken beneath the boots of one man's legions, its ancient constitution as dead as the senators who had fled before Caesar's eagles. Its traditions scattered like leaves before the wind of change that would transform Rome from a city-state into the eternal empire of legend. The dust of civil war had barely settled across the Roman territories when Caesar found himself drawn inexorably eastward, following the fleeing figure of Pompey toward the ancient lands where civilization itself had first taken root. The great general, who had once been his ally and son-in-law, had sought sanctuary in Egypt, that mystical realm where the Nile's waters had nourished empires for 3 millennia before Rome had even dreamed of greatness. Caesar's pursuit carried him across the wine-dark Mediterranean, his war galleys cutting through waters that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless dynasties, their bronze-reinforced prows slicing toward shores where pharaohs had once been worshipped as living gods. When Caesar's ships finally approached the harbour of Alexandria in the autumn of 48 BCE, the city that stretched before him represented the very pinnacle of Hellenistic achievement. The great lighthouse of Pharos rose like a marble titan from its island, its beacon fire casting dancing shadows across waters crowded with vessels from every corner of the known world. The famous library, repository of human knowledge accumulated over centuries, stood as a monument to learning that dwarfed even Rome's greatest intellectual achievements. Streets paved with stones quarried from distant mountains wound between buildings whose architectural splendor bore the refined touches of Greek artistry married to Egyptian grandeur, creating a metropolis that seemed to float between earth and sky like something conjured from the dreams of poets. But the Egypt that Caesar encountered was a kingdom riven by internal strife, where the last pharaonic dynasty struggled to maintain its grip on power, while Roman influence grew ever stronger. The Ptolemaic rulers, descendants of Alexander's general who had claimed Egypt as his prize 3 centuries earlier, had grown soft and decadent through generations of intermarriage and palace intrigue. The reigning Cleopatra VII, herself descended from a line that had once commanded the loyalty of millions, now found her throne contested by her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a mere boy whose ambitions were manipulated by advisors who dreamed of glory through association with Roman power. The news that greeted Caesar upon his arrival shattered whatever expectations he might have harbored about a triumphant reunion with his former colleague. Pompey the Great, the man who had once commanded legions and conquered the East, had been murdered as he stepped onto Egyptian soil, cut down by assassins who believed his death would purchase them favor with the approaching Caesar. The head of Rome's greatest general, preserved in the manner of ancient Egyptian funeral rites, was presented to Caesar as a grotesque gift that spoke to the depths of political calculation and moral bankruptcy that had infected even this most ancient of civilizations. Caesar's reaction to this macabre offering revealed the complex nature of his character, that intricate weaving of pragmatism and genuine sentiment that had carried him to the heights of power. Though Pompey had been his enemy in civil war, he had also been his ally, his family member through marriage, his partner in the complicated dance of Roman politics. The tears that Caesar shed were witnessed by Egyptian courtiers who had expected gratitude for their bloody service, but instead found themselves confronting a conqueror whose humanity had been touched by this final, ignoble end to a once glorious career. Into this atmosphere of political uncertainty and moral ambiguity stepped Cleopatra herself, a woman whose intelligence and charisma would prove to match Caesar's own formidable capabilities. The stories of her arrival, smuggled into his presence, wrapped in a carpet, or concealed within a bundle of bedding, have become the stuff of legend, but they speak to a deeper truth about her character. Here was a ruler who understood that power in the ancient world often required audacity, that the conventional paths of diplomacy might prove insufficient when dealing with a man who had just crossed the Rubicon and emerged victorious from civil war. Cleopatra was no mere ornament of royal blood, despite the way later Roman historians would choose to portray her. She was a woman of considerable learning, said to speak 9 languages fluently, and to possess a deep understanding of mathematics, philosophy, and rhetoric. Her kingdom, though politically weakened, remained one of the wealthiest in the Mediterranean world, its granaries feeding much of the Roman population, its artisans producing luxuries that graced the finest Roman homes. The queen who presented herself to Caesar was both a potential ally of immense strategic value and an intellectual equal capable of engaging with the most sophisticated political minds of the age. The alliance that developed between Caesar and Cleopatra transcended mere political convenience, though it certainly served the interests of both parties. For Caesar, Egypt offered not only vast wealth and strategic position, but also the chance to present himself as the heir to Alexander the Great, the Western conqueror who had brought Greek civilization to the ancient East. For Cleopatra, the Roman general represented protection against internal enemies and the possibility of restoring Egypt to something approaching its former glory under the protective aegis of Roman power. Their relationship unfolded against the backdrop of Alexandria's magnificent palace complex, where rooms lined with precious stones looked out over gardens where exotic plants from across Africa bloomed in carefully tended beds. The couple moved through chambers decorated with hieroglyphs that told stories of pharaohs who had ruled when Rome was nothing more than a collection of mud huts beside the Tiber. In halls where the accumulated wisdom of centuries was stored in countless papyrus scrolls, Caesar encountered a civilization far older and in many ways more sophisticated than his own, a culture that had mastered arts and sciences while his ancestors were still learning to work bronze. The months that Caesar spent in Egypt allowed him to consolidate his position as master of the Roman world, while simultaneously securing the Eastern Mediterranean for Roman interests. His presence stabilized Cleopatra's rule, his legions ensuring that her brother's supporters could mount no effective challenge to her authority. Roman engineering expertise was applied to Egyptian projects, improving harbors and strengthening fortifications, while Roman military advisors helped reorganize the Egyptian army along more modern lines. During this period, Caesar also demonstrated his capacity for cultural appreciation that went beyond mere military conquest. He participated in religious ceremonies that honored gods whose worship had continued unbroken for millennia, showing a respect for local traditions that would become a hallmark of Roman imperial policy. The famous journey up the Nile that he undertook with Cleopatra served multiple purposes, displaying Roman power to Egyptian populations, while allowing Caesar to study firsthand the agricultural systems that made Egypt the granary of the Mediterranean world. The birth of Caesarion, the son that Cleopatra bore to Caesar, represented both the personal dimension of their relationship and its broader political implications. This child, whether or not Caesar formally acknowledged him, embodied the fusion of Roman and Egyptian royal bloodlines, a living symbol of the new order that was emerging as Rome extended its dominion over the ancient world. The boy would grow up in a palace where Roman eagles stood beside Egyptian sacred symbols, where Latin mixed with Greek and Egyptian in the polyglot atmosphere of cosmopolitan Alexandria. Caesar's eventual departure from Egypt marked not an ending, but a transformation in the relationship between Rome and the Ptolemaic kingdom. He left behind Egypt securely under Cleopatra's rule, but firmly within the Roman sphere of influence, arrangement that would endure for the remainder of her reign. The eastern Mediterranean had been secured for Rome not through the brutal subjugation that had characterized the conquest of Gaul, but through a sophisticated blend of military power, political alliance, and personal relationship that demonstrated Caesar's evolution as both general and statesman. As Caesar's ships finally departed Alexandria's harbour, carrying him toward new campaigns and the final consolidation of his power, the city behind him had been forever changed by his presence, just as he had been marked by his encounter with the ancient civilization of the pharaohs and the remarkable woman who was its last great ruler. The spring winds that carried Caesar's ships westward from Alexandria bore more than just the scent of Mediterranean salt and distant shores. They carried the whispered promises of transformation, the weight of accumulated victories, and the dreams of a man who had gazed upon the ancient pyramids and found them wanting, compared to the monument he would build from the living stones of Roman society. The Egyptian sun had bronzed his weathered features and sharpened his already keen understanding of power's true nature. Lessons learned not merely from conquest, but from observing how the descendants of Alexander had wielded absolute authority over the fertile Nile Delta for 3 centuries. As the familiar outline of Italian coastline emerged from the morning mist, Caesar stood at the prow of his flagship, his scarlet cloak catching the dawn light like a banner of inevitable change. Behind him sailed not merely the remnants of his legions, but the accumulated wealth of nations, the spoils of campaigns that had stretched from the fog-shrouded forests of Britannia to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. The ship's holds groaned under the weight of gold and silver, precious stones and exotic treasures. But more valuable still were the ideas that had taken root in his mind during those long months beside the Nile, watching Cleopatra govern with a wisdom that transcended the crude mechanics of Roman administration. Rome itself seemed to hold its breath as word of his approach spread through the narrow streets and across the 7 hills. The city that had birthed him, shaped him, and then watched him stride across the known world like some figure from the oldest myths, now prepared to receive him not as a returning son, but as something altogether more profound and dangerous. The senators who had once debated his fate in marble halls now found themselves trembling in their togas, while the common people gathered in the Forum Romanum spoke his name with a mixture of awe and anticipation that had not been heard since the legendary kings had walked these same stones. When Caesar finally entered Rome in the autumn of 47 BCE, he came not with the traditional triumph of a conquering general, but with the measured stride of one who understood that true power lay not in spectacle, but in the quiet revolution of daily governance. The dictatorship that had been granted to him in his absence was no mere temporary expedient, no brief assumption of emergency powers to restore order after civil strife. It was, as he well understood, and as the city would soon discover, the foundation stone of an entirely new conception of what Rome could become. The traditional mechanisms of the Republic, those ancient checks and balances that had served adequately when Rome was merely one Italian city among many, now creaked and groaned under the weight of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Caesar moved through these fossilized institutions like a skilled surgeon, cutting away what had become gangrenous while carefully preserving what remained vital. His reforms began subtly, almost imperceptibly, with adjustments to the calendar that had become so distorted by political manipulation that harvest festivals were being celebrated in spring and winter rituals performed under summer suns. The new calendar, based on the sophisticated astronomical observations he had studied in Alexandria, represented more than mere practical convenience. It was a declaration that Roman civilization would no longer be bound by the accumulated errors and petty corruptions of the past. That precision and rational planning would replace the chaos of traditional muddle. Each day of this reformed year would unfold according to natural law rather than political whim, and citizens from Gaul to Syria would know that when Caesar's Rome declared a date, it could be trusted absolutely. But time itself was merely the framework within which far more profound changes began to unfold. The Roman citizenship, that jealously guarded privilege, that had once distinguished the inhabitants of 7 hills from all other peoples, began to spread like ripples on a still pond. Communities throughout Gaul, whose warriors had faced Caesar's legions and found themselves transformed from enemies to allies, discovered that their loyalty had earned them not merely protection, but inclusion in the greatest political experiment the world had ever known. Spanish towns that had prospered under Roman governance for generations suddenly found their leading citizens invited to participate in the Senate itself, their voices joining the ancient chorus of Roman debate. The city of Rome itself became a vast construction site, as Caesar's vision took physical form in stone and marble. The forum that bore his name began to rise adjacent to the ancient heart of the city. Its columns and porticos, designed not merely to accommodate the business of governance, but to inspire all who entered with a sense of permanence and grandeur. Here was architecture that spoke of centuries to come, of an empire that would endure not through the crude expedient of military occupation, but through the willing participation of peoples who saw in Roman law and custom something worthy of their deepest loyalty. The gladiatorial games that had long served as both entertainment and political theatre were transformed under Caesar's guidance into spectacles of unprecedented magnificence, but also into vehicles for a subtler kind of education. The crowds that gathered in the Circus Maximus to witness these carefully choreographed displays of courage and skill were simultaneously being taught lessons about the rewards of loyalty, the nobility of sacrifice, and the glory that awaited those who served the new Rome with distinction. Each contest became a living parable, each victory a demonstration of the virtues that Caesar hoped to instill throughout his expanding realm. The grain distributions that had long been a source of political manipulation were regularized and expanded, but with a crucial difference that revealed the depth of Caesar's understanding of human nature. No longer would hungry citizens be forced to grovel before petty magistrates or curry favor with corrupt officials to secure their daily bread. Instead, the great granaries that rose along the Tiber would dispense their bounty according to fixed schedules and clear criteria, removing both the uncertainty that had terrorized the poor and the opportunities for corruption that had enriched the unscrupulous. In this single reform, Caesar demonstrated that true power lay not in the ability to withhold necessities, but in the capacity to provide them so reliably that they ceased to be sources of anxiety and became instead foundations for higher aspirations. The courts of law, those forums where Roman justice had too often devolved into contests of wealth and influence, were reformed with equal thoroughness. New procedures were established that favored evidence over eloquence, substance over style, and the careful weighing of facts over the theatrical manipulation of emotions. Judges were selected according to merit rather than political connection, and their decisions were recorded with a precision that made corruption far more difficult to conceal. Throughout the provinces, local disputes that had once festered for years while awaiting the attention of distant Roman officials were now resolved with unprecedented speed and fairness. Binding diverse peoples to the empire, not through fear, but through gratitude for justice received. The great libraries that Caesar established in Rome and throughout the provinces represented perhaps his most far-sighted achievement, for they embodied his understanding that lasting power must be built upon a foundation of knowledge and wisdom, rather than mere force of arms. Scribes worked day and night to copy the works of Greek philosophers, Egyptian mathematicians, and Celtic bards, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of all peoples would be preserved and made available to future generations. In these halls of learning, the sons of Gallic chieftains studied alongside the grandsons of Roman senators, their minds shaped not by the narrow prejudices of their birth, but by exposure to the greatest thoughts that humanity had yet produced. As the months passed and Caesar's reforms took deeper root in Roman soil, it became increasingly clear that what was emerging was not merely a restored republic, but something entirely new in the history of human governance. This was an empire in the truest sense, not a collection of subject territories, but a voluntary association of peoples who had discovered that their own highest aspirations could be achieved more fully within the Roman framework than through any merely local arrangements. From the wine-dark waters of the Mediterranean to the fog-shrouded shores of distant Britannia, diverse nations were learning to speak with a single voice while never losing the distinctive melodies of their own cultural inheritance. Caesar had given them something more precious than mere peace and prosperity. He had given them a vision of what human society could become when guided by reason, justice, and an unwavering commitment to the common good. His reforms flowed through Roman society like water through parched earth, transforming everything they touched. Yet beneath the surface of this golden age, darker currents had begun to gather strength. The senators, who had once commanded the respect of nations, now found themselves reduced to mere advisors in their own halls, their ancient prerogatives dissolved in the wake of Caesar's sweeping changes. While the common people celebrated their dictator's generosity and vision, the marble corridors of the Senate House echoed with whispered conversations that carried the weight of accumulated grievances and wounded pride. The conspiracy that would ultimately claim Caesar's life did not spring forth suddenly like a summer storm, but rather accumulated slowly, deliberately, like sediment settling in still water. Marcus Junius Brutus, descendant of the legendary founder of the Republic, wrestled with conflicting loyalties that tore at his noble heart like opposing winds. Caesar had shown him nothing but kindness and favor, treating him almost as a beloved son. Yet the weight of his ancestral legacy pressed upon his shoulders with each passing day. His ancestor had driven out the last king of Rome, establishing the republic that had endured for centuries. And now that same republic seemed to be dissolving beneath the steady pressure of one man's overwhelming presence. Gaius Cassius Longinus, lean and sharp-eyed as a hunting hawk, had nursed his resentment longer and with greater intensity than most. The sting of Caesar's clemency after Pharsalus had never truly healed, for mercy, when offered by one who had once been an equal, carries within it an implicit acknowledgement of submission that proud men find difficult to bear. Cassius moved through the social gatherings of Rome's elite like a patient fisherman, casting his nets with careful precision, drawing other senators into conversations that began with complaints about the weather or the price of grain, but inevitably turned toward weightier matters of governance and tradition. The number of conspirators grew steadily through the winter months, their meetings concealed beneath the ordinary rhythms of Roman social life. They gathered in private gardens where the sound of fountains masked their voices, met in the shadow of temple columns during religious festivals, and found moments of whispered conference in the baths where steam obscured their faces and muffled their words. Each new recruit brought his own particular grievance, his own vision of what Rome should be, yet they were united by a shared conviction that the Republic's ancient balance had been irretrievably lost beneath the weight of Caesar's singular authority. Decimus Brutus, Caesar's trusted lieutenant and adopted heir, perhaps carried the heaviest burden of all the conspirators. His betrayal would cut deeper than any blade, for it represented the violation of sacred bonds that had sustained Roman society since its founding. The relationship between patron and client, between adoptive father and son, between commander and loyal officer, all these ancient ties would be severed in a single moment of violence, their dissolution marking not merely the end of one man's life, but the destruction of trust itself. The soothsayers and augurs of Rome had begun to report troubling omens in the weeks leading up to the Ides of March. The sacred chickens refused their feed, an occurrence so rare that even the most skeptical senators took notice. Lightning struck the statue of Caesar that had been erected in the Campus Martius, leaving a jagged crack that ran from crown to base like a wound that would not heal. Dreams filled with blood and portents troubled the sleep of citizens throughout the city, and the haruspices who examined the sacrificial animals found livers spotted with dark marks that they interpreted as warnings of impending catastrophe. Caesar himself seemed to move through these final days wrapped in a strange mixture of confidence and resignation, as though some part of him sensed the approaching storm, while another part remained focused on the pressing matters of state that demanded his attention. His wife Calpurnia was tormented by nightmares in which she held his lifeless body in her arms, her tears falling like rain upon his pallid face. The night before the Ides of March, she dreamed that the pediment of their house collapsed, and she woke with Caesar's name on her lips and terror in her heart. The morning of March 15th dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze stirring the olive trees and the early spring flowers beginning to show their colours in the gardens of the wealthy. Caesar rose early, as was his custom, and prepared for what he expected to be an ordinary session of the Senate. The conspirators had chosen their moment with careful calculation, knowing that Caesar would be present at the meeting and that the sanctity of the Senate House would prevent his bodyguards from accompanying him inside. The irony was bitter beyond measure. The very institution they claimed to be defending would become the stage for the Republic's final, fatal wound. Calpurnia begged her husband to remain at home, her woman's intuition sensing dangers that reason could not identify or explain. She spoke of her dreams, of the omens that had multiplied like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, of the strange reluctance she felt to let him leave their house on this particular morning. For a moment, Caesar wavered, touched by her concern, and perhaps by his own half-acknowledged premonitions, but duty called louder than fear, and the pressing business of empire would not wait for superstitious concerns to be resolved. The soothsayer Spurina encountered Caesar on his way to the Senate House, calling out the traditional warning about the Ides of March that had become almost a ritual between them. Caesar's response carried the confidence of a man who had faced death on 100 battlefields and emerged victorious from encounters that had claimed the lives of lesser men. "The Ides of March have come," he observed with something approaching amusement, as though the mere arrival of the date had disproven the prophecy. Spurina's reply would echo through history with prophetic weight. "Aye, they have come, but they have not yet passed." The Senate House filled with the usual complement of toga-clad figures, their white garments creating an almost celestial atmosphere in the morning light that streamed through the high windows. The conspirators had positioned themselves with strategic care, some near the doors to prevent escape, others close to Caesar's accustomed seat, all of them struggling to maintain expressions of casual normalcy, while their hearts hammered against their ribs like caged birds desperate for freedom. The ordinary business of the Senate proceeded at its customary measured pace, with debates about public works and provincial appointments, creating a veneer of normalcy that masked the terrible drama about to unfold. When the moment finally arrived, it came with shocking suddenness, despite months of careful planning. The petition presented to Caesar served as the signal, and the conspirators moved with the desperate efficiency of men who knew that hesitation would mean discovery and death. The first blow was struck by Casca, his blade finding its mark with trembling accuracy, and then the others closed in like wolves upon a wounded stag, their daggers rising and falling in a frenzy of violence that stained the marble floor with the crimson proof of their deed. Caesar fought at first, his warrior's instincts compelling him to defend himself even in the face of overwhelming odds. But when he saw Brutus among his attackers, something inside him seemed to break, and he covered his head with his toga, accepting the inevitable with the dignity that had marked his entire extraordinary life. The marble statues stood silent in the gathering dusk of the Roman Forum, their weathered faces catching the last golden light of another Mediterranean sunset. Among them, carved in pristine white stone, the likeness of Gaius Julius Caesar gazed eternally across the cobblestones where his blood had once pooled beneath Pompey's theatre. But death, as the Romans understood better than most, was merely the beginning of a different kind of existence. And for Caesar, it would prove to be the gateway to immortality itself. In the months following the Ides of March, as Rome convulsed with civil war and the conspirators fled into exile, something remarkable began to emerge from the chaos of the dictator's assassination. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and master of rhetoric, stood before the Roman people and spoke of omens and signs that had appeared since their leader's death. A comet blazed across the night sky for 7 consecutive evenings, its tail stretching like a silver ribbon against the velvet darkness. The common people, who had loved Caesar for his generosity and his games, whispered that this celestial visitor was none other than the soul of their fallen champion, ascending to take his place among the gods. The political machinery of deification moved with surprising swiftness through the corridors of power. Within 2 years of Caesar's death, the Senate formally declared him Divus Iulius, the divine Julius, conferring upon him the ultimate honor that Roman society could bestow. Temples rose in his memory, their columns reaching toward the heavens like fingers of worked stone, their interiors filled with the soft glow of oil lamps and the sweet smoke of incense. Priests tended the sacred flames that burned perpetually in his honor, their voices joining in ancient hymns that would echo through the centuries. The calendar itself bore witness to his transformation, as the month of Quinctilis became Julius, ensuring that his name would be spoken by every citizen as the seasons turned and the years passed. Yet the true measure of Caesar's immortality lay not in the formal declarations of the Senate or the rituals performed in marble temples, but in the way his name became woven into the very fabric of human language and thought. Across the vast expanse of the growing empire, children learned to speak his name before they could properly pronounce their own. The title Caesar evolved beyond a personal identifier, becoming synonymous with supreme authority itself. In the Germanic forests beyond the Rhine, tribal chieftains would one day style themselves as Kaiser, their rough consonants shaping the Latin syllables into something both familiar and foreign. In the distant steppes of Russia, the word would transform again, becoming Tsar, carrying with it the weight of absolute power across frozen plains where Roman legions had never marched. The influence spread like ripples across a still pond, touching shores that Caesar himself had never imagined. Byzantine emperors, ruling from their jeweled capital on the Bosphorus, claimed the mantle of his authority even as they worshipped a god he had never known. Medieval kings, their crowns gleaming in the candlelight of Gothic cathedrals, traced their legitimacy back through the mists of time to the man who had crossed the Rubicon with a single legion at his back. The very concept of empire, that magnificent and terrible idea that would shape human civilization for 2 millennia, bore the invisible stamp of his ambition and his understanding of power's true nature. Writers and poets, those keepers of memory and shapers of legend, found in Caesar's story an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Shakespeare's quill scratched across parchment by flickering candlelight, bringing the dictator to life again in blank verse that would outlast the stones of the Forum itself. The playwright Caesar spoke of death and destiny with words that had never passed the historical man's lips, yet somehow captured something essential about his character and his fate. Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once, the fictional Caesar declared, and in that line lived something true about the man who had faced down enemies from Gaul to Egypt with unwavering courage. The military academies of later ages studied his campaigns with the intensity of religious devotion, their students poring over maps of ancient battlefields until the names of obscure Gallic tribes became as familiar as the streets of their own cities. Alesia, Phasalis, Zela. these distant places entered the vocabulary of strategic thought, their lessons dissected and analyzed by generals who would never see the Mediterranean sun, but who understood that Caesar's tactical brilliance transcended the limitations of time and geography. Napoleon himself, that other great conqueror who would reshape the map of Europe, kept a copy of Caesar's commentaries at his bedside, finding in those precise, understated accounts of campaign and conquest a kindred spirit across the centuries. The Renaissance painters, their brushes loaded with pigments ground from precious stones, depicted Caesar in their grand frescoes and oil paintings, clothing him in the fashions of their own age, while maintaining something timeless in his bearing. He appeared in flowing robes and Renaissance armor, his face bearing the noble features that artists believed befitted a man of such stature. These images, reproduced in countless copies and variations, became the visual vocabulary through which later generations would remember him, until the actual features of the historical Caesar were lost beneath layers of artistic interpretation and wishful thinking. Political theorists and philosophers found in his career a rich vein of material for their meditations on power, democracy, and the nature of leadership itself. Machiavelli wrote of him with grudging admiration, recognizing in Caesar's rise the ruthless pragmatism that the prince would later codify into political doctrine. The American founding fathers, gathered in their sweltering Philadelphia meeting rooms during that epochal summer of 1787, invoked his name as a cautionary tale, their fear of Caesarism shaping the very structure of their new republic. They built their government with deliberate checks and balances, haunted by the spectre of another man on horseback who might cross another Rubicon and claim dictatorial power. Yet even as they feared his example, they could not escape his influence. The architecture of Washington, D.C. spoke in the visual language of Rome, its marble facades and classical columns deliberately evoking the grandeur of the Forum where Caesar had once walked. The Capitol itself, that dome-crowned temple of American democracy, took its name from the Capitoline Hill where Roman senators had once debated the fate of the world. The senators who gathered beneath its rotunda carried titles that echoed across 2 millennia, their deliberations conducted according to procedures that would have seemed familiar to Cicero or Cato the Younger. In the quiet hours of evening, when the last tourists had departed from the ruins of the Forum, and the cats that lived among the broken columns emerged to hunt in the moonlight, something of Caesar's presence seemed to linger still in the warm Roman air. The stones themselves held memories, having witnessed the full arc of his extraordinary life, from ambitious young quaestor to deified dictator. Here he had spoken to crowds, dispensed justice, received foreign ambassadors, and planned the campaigns that would extend Roman power to the edges of the known world. The Eternal City continued its ancient rhythms around the ruins of his world, the modern Romans hurrying past on their way to contemporary concerns, most unaware that they walked daily through the theatre of history itself. Yet in their language, in their laws, in the very structure of their civilization, the influence of the man they had once called Caesar persevered, as constant and invisible as the air they breathed. His legacy had become so fundamental to the Western world that it was no longer noticed, like the foundation stones of a great building that remain hidden beneath centuries of construction and renovation, but continue to bear the weight of everything built above. And so the legend endured, neither diminished by time nor exhausted by countless retellings, as timeless and mysterious as the marble faces that gazed out from museum pedestals across the world, their stone eyes holding secrets that would never be fully revealed. In the end, Caesar had achieved something far greater than mere conquest or political power. He had become immortal in the truest sense, living on in the collective memory of humanity itself, his name destined to be spoken as long as people gathered to tell stories of ambition, courage, and the eternal human desire to leave a mark upon the turning world.